wind howls a lonely tune tonight.
I reside on the outskirts of a little highway town in northern Utah. Along the major route, there are only a few shops, truck stops, and a motel. All of the roads leading to the outside are made of dirt and only lead to a few other residences as well as vast private tracts of grassy fields and forest. For me, this day was really ordinary. I worked from home remotely until about 6 o'clock. After that, I went into town to get some groceries and restock on a few household necessities. Despite being a highway town, none of the stores were ever overly packed because the highway wasn't very busy. I started shopping as soon as I pulled in. However, I happened to see a man staring at me when I was inside. I didn't give it much thought at first. I most likely just happened to glance at him at the wrong moment as he was staring at me. I continued shopping, but a few minutes later in a different aisle I noticed him once more in the corner of my eye. He entered the same vacant aisle that I was in and stood 5 or 6 feet away from me. I continued to search for what I needed by looking forward. However, I saw that he wasn't actually gripping anything or moving about. Thus, I moved my eyes slightly to get a better look at him. I could tell he was staring at me even though I wasn't staring at him. I said hello this time and carried on with my business. The man remained silent back to me. I hurried up, picked up what I needed, and walked out of the aisle. To be honest, I wasn't giving it much attention. I just thought the guy was a little strange. After paying for everything at the checkout counter, I went back outside to my car. As usual, I parked in the extreme back of the lot. I loaded everything into the trunk and climbed in. There were perhaps 30 or 40 more automobiles in the parking lot when I looked up, but something didn't seem right. Then I saw him once again. He was standing between 2 automobiles and staring at me. I doubt he even checked out or received anything because he didn't have any items in his hands. This guy was crazy. Most likely a weird truck driver who has only had 2 hours of sleep. I left the parking lot and made my way home. The deserted dirt roads were silent and dark as the sun had mostly set. I parked in front of carried in the first few grocery bags. A phone call from my dad distracted me a little while I was putting that stuff away, but I soon returned to it and went back outside to my car to get the other items. I noticed something when I did. There was a truck way out and somewhat off the side of the dirt road, but I had to squint and give my eyes time to acclimate to the darkness. All of its lights were off. The night sky silhouetted its general outline, which was all I could make out. That truck was on my property, which is just less than 40 acres. When I drove home, it was unquestionably absent. Furthermore, why would it be parked without lights if it was simply turning around or lost? I gradually approached my car and removed my groceries while continuously monitoring the truck. The most plausible explanation I could come up with was that it might have been an ordinary driver who turned off the highway and decided to stay on this vacant land rather than pay for a motel. Wasn't going to raise a problem if I didn't have to, even though it was on my land. You never know who might be there or what they might do. I returned inside. Following the tossing, I put the goods away and pulled open the front curtains to keep a watch on the outside world. Over the course of the following hour or two, I became less and less anxious about it and came to the conclusion that the driver was most likely asleep. It's still weird, but innocuous. I watched a TV in the living room for a further hour without seeing the truck move. I walked upstairs to get into bed after closing the curtains because it was getting late. I believe I went to sleep really quickly, but I had to go to the bathroom when I woke up in the middle of the night. I believe it was between 2 and 3 in the morning, although I never checked the time. Half sleepy, I woke up and crossed the bedroom floor to enter the restroom's hallway. I heard a stream downstairs as soon as I opened the door. That was something I had never heard of before. After listening for a moment, I shut and opened the door to check if it did not happen again. I went to the end of the corridor and peered down the steps. There was something in that downstairs corridor, even though it was completely dark with only a little moonlight streaming in through the kitchen windows. A shadow was visible to me, slightly shifting on the wall's side. My pulse started racing right away, even though I couldn't determine if it was in the hallway or perhaps outside the rear door, and the shadow was only reflecting onto the wall. Silently, I retreated and returned to my room, shutting the door as carefully and slowly as possible to avoid drawing attention to myself. I then grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I said softly. I waited for 5 minutes and heard nothing. I began to question their presence in my house, but then I heard the creaking once more. Walking across the floor under me very slowly and subtly They appeared to have entered the living room. A minute later, a police vehicle arrived. Just as the officers rushed up, there was a flurry of footsteps scurrying around down there and eventually fleeing my house. Fortunately, they managed to catch him sprinting back up toward the field parked truck. Unsettlingly, I realized him as the eerie man from the store before. I suppose he was actually pursuing me. He was armed, which was more scarier than him pursuing me and breaking into my house. Although the man said he was only attempting to rob me, it appeared far more intimate than that. I'm not sure how long he spent in my house, but he never took anything. He had nothing to carry, not even a backpack. He also knew I was at home. He was most likely spent the entire night observing me from outside. It's best to keep what he actually would have done a secret. This happened last summer while on a road trip. I was driving 4 hours a day to a different location because I was taking a lengthy trip home after seeing some relatives. This came after my previous quit. To the best of my knowledge, the final 8 hours of the drive home were spent in empty woods. I wanted to see another city, but I couldn't justify stopping because it was too far away. There, I departed around 6 p.m. from my previous stop in order to reach my last Airbnb reservation, which was at a cabin approximately 2 hours distant. It was on the way. I went with it because I wanted to get home. I reasoned that it would be preferable to whatever cheap subpar motel was located nearby. Although the terrain where I was somewhat flat, there were a respectable quantity of trees dispersed throughout. When I arrived at the cabin, it was evident that they had placed a row of big pine trees in front of it, with a gravel driveway running through the center. To be honest, it felt a little eerie when combined with the surroundings. I parked and used the code I received via email from the host to unlock the padlock. Although it appeared to be an Airbnb, the interior of the cottage was incredibly lovely and appeared to have been recently refurbished. Tiny but comfortable. Since I would just be there for the night, I didn't unpack much. I picked up a supper from a drive-thru and sat at the table to eat it. However, 15 minutes after I had settled in, there was a knock on the door. I was shocked because I had never heard a car arrive or seen anyone go outside. I stood up and answered the door. A man with a shaven head and a gray and black beard appeared to be in his 40s. He grinned and replied, "Hello, I was just stopping by to make sure you got in and everything was good." I replied I was okay and everything went well, even though I knew it was just the host now. After saying goodnight, I closed the door. He unexpectedly stopped over to check on me, which I found a little odd, but I assumed he must have lived nearby or perhaps even across the land. It's also important to note that the man had an exceptionally potent smell coming from him. The scent suggested that he had spent the entire day exercising in a field. It just seemed a little strange to me as well. I returned to the table, completed my meal, and then showered to prepare for theat night. I was only there for about 5 minutes before I felt enough exhausted to want to go to bed. After drying off, I got into bed and spent some time on my phone before hearing another knock at the front door. I was just as afraid of this one as I was the first because, once more, I didn't hear a car arrive or anyone go outside. Once more, it had to be the host. However, why? And he simply arrived so quickly. I realized this was strange right away, and it made me feel quite uneasy. Naturally, there was no text or call from him when I looked at my phone. I heard him knock a few more times as I cautiously entered the main area. I ended up simply yelling out from the other side and asking what he needed, even though I wasn't sure if I wanted to answer the door. He ceased his knocking. "Would you please open the door? I had one more question for you." "I'll move quickly, I swear." I honestly didn't know what to say, so I remained silent for a short while. In those brief moments he must have received, he knocked on the door once more and asked if I could open it, indicating that he was impatient. I mentioned that I wasn't feeling well and that it was late. Therefore, I would prefer to be left alone if there wasn't an emergency. After that, he took a long time to respond. The quiet was rather unsettling. It was even more so when a full minute had passed. I didn't hear him leave. Was he simply standing there then? I approached in silence and peered through the door's little window. There was no sign of him. I assumed right away that he must have slipped away because, if he had simply left, I would have heard his footsteps on the gravel. Then again, where was he? I had no idea what to do. I was quite uneasy and had no idea why he was behaving in such odd. For a minute, I stood by the door and listened for anything. To be honest, I was afraid to move, but then I happened to look at one of the living room windows. His eyes were fixed on mine. In a panic, I ran to the bedroom and dialed 911. I heard what sounded like him attempting to open the window as I waited, which was both frightening and strange because he must have had a key to his own home. But that's when I understood everything. The host wasn't that dude. When the cops arrived, this was verified. He had already fled. We were able to get in touch with the cabin's owner and host, although we're not sure which way. I have no idea what that dude was up to that evening. Clearly, he was obviously plotting and lying. Something, but I'm relieved that I didn't let the door open. It was spring vacation. I was 18. Additionally, my family traveled to a tiny cabin in Minnesota this year. My mom, my younger brother, who was just 7 years old, and I were the only ones there. We were scheduled to spend the entire week at this cabin, and we were traveling to Minnesota in part to see some of the smaller towns and look for a potential future home. In any case, we had never visited the cabin my mother reserved, and I doubt she was aware of its distance from the nearest towns. Most likely, she was more worried about the cost. The distance from any retail places was approximately 35 minutes, and it was located far north. However, I suppose it was a useful test of our ability to adapt to country living. There was a slight drive there, more than 10 hours. My mother drove the remaining hours after I drove for the first few. At dusk, we arrived at the cabin. The orange skies above the thick forest and wildlife were quite lovely, significantly distinct from the towers, and we were accustomed to enormous office towers. But the cabin itself was clearly outdated. It didn't appear to have been competently constructed, and everything creaked. But that was all right. After all, it was a cabin. Everything. After the long drive, we spent the night relaxing and experimenting with the wood-burning fireplace. I spent the majority of the evening sleeping. I took a long nap, so I stayed up a little longer than my mom, who went to bed at 8:30. I was alone in the cottage since my younger brother was also in his room. After spending some time on my phone by the fireplace, I decided to go out the back porch for some fresh air. It was a tiny wooden deck with a few chairs and a dubious-looking fire pit in the center, all surrounding it. I took a seat and gazed out into the woods. It was a really calm night. There are no automobiles or crowded streets, just the trees rustling in the wind and the occasional bird crowing in the distance. I adored it. Being, however, it was a little colder up north than I had anticipated, I decided to try the fire pit after noticing some logs piled up on the cabin side. I guess it wasn't as shady as I imagined because I lit it up without any issues, and the fire remained well maintained in the center. In any case, I spent some time sitting by it. I simply took it all in because I never get to do this kind of thing. After being outside for about half an hour, there was an abrupt and totally unexpected sound coming from the trees. To be honest, I had no idea what it may have been. However, it sounded and reverberated through the woods in a way that reminded me of an axe cutting through wood or a tree. But there was only one sound, and I didn't think anyone could possibly be out this close to us. Since it was completely dark outside, he was unable to see anything. However, it sounded somewhat similar, whatever it was. After hearing the sound, I remained outside for the following 5 minutes, during which time my anxiety began to somewhat increase. It was just this unpleasant feeling that destroyed the previous tranquility. In the end, I returning to the cabin after extinguishing the fire pit. My brother and mother were already asleep, based on what I could hear, but I wasn't really exhausted yet. I'm not sure if it was the sound I heard waking me up or the extended snooze, but I still didn't truly want to go to bed yet. I continued to use my phone in the living room. I didn't need to worry about Wi-Fi because I had several movies downloaded. After around 15 minutes, I heard something. I put the film on hold and listened. I couldn't tell if it was the wind striking the walls or the cabin creaking from someone getting up or moving around their room. However, it made me feel uneasy once more. I believe that because I wasn't accustomed to this type of setting, I received so easily agitated, but I didn't hear it again for another minute. Instead of the bedrooms, it came from the other end of the cottage this time. It came from just next to me outside the wall. There was just a window. I took a deeper look and paid attention. The front door was shaken by a series of loud knocks just as I thought I might hear anything. The wooden walls trembled. I became frozen for. After a little period, I heard my mother rise out of bed and rush into the hallway, inquiring as to what it was. Even though I knew something wasn't right, I told her that someone was at the door as I stood up. She was clearly quite afraid as well. She returned right away to get. There was no reason for someone to be pounding on our cabin door in the middle of the night and in the middle of nowhere, so she picked up her phone and dialed 911. I approached the door and peered through the peephole as she did. It was really dark. No porch lights were present or anything, but I could make out the outline of a man standing very near, simply gazing at the door in front of me, and the outline of a heavy wooden axe in his hand was visible to me in the darkness. My nerves spiked and my eyes widened. My head was racing with everything. It tried to come up with a rationale why this wasn't what it appeared to be. I'm not sure if he was lost or in need of assistance. This didn't seem to be anything but negative. My mom was on the phone with an operator when the man repeatedly knocked on the door. They never said, however, offering any justification for their presence. They simply pounded on the door violently. It was difficult to gauge how much time had elapsed in the heat of the moment, but it seemed to go on forever. However, he then performed what we were all fearful. The door was slammed shut with a loud crack and a tiny piece of the metal axe penetrated the wood. We all fled into the farthest room and locked ourselves there at that time. There were just 4 or 5 more knocks on the door before they stopped. It was unclear to us if he had broken the door. We waited to see if he had given up or was already down. The first officer arrived to the cabin in less than 15 minutes, which was really faster than anticipated considering how far away we were. There were multiple huge gashes in the front door, but there was no indication that the man had entered. Additionally, there were no indications of the man's whereabouts. We simply presumed that he strolled back into the woods. The prevailing view is that the man was in the forest when he noticed my campfire from a distance, enticing him to come to the cottage. It doesn't clarify why he was using an axe outside at night, or why he approached the cabin, but there isn't exactly a way to find out without apprehending and interrogating him. Clearly, we didn't stay there any longer. We didn't move there, in case you were wondering. Either way,